The 1937 flood has left a lasting imprint on Clermont County. 75 years ago, the Ohio River stormed out of its banks for 10 days in January, claiming lives, property, entire communities.
We saw it coming up, and they kept telling about it, how it kept raining and everything, and my husband said, we better be getting out.
That was our Katrina.
Well, it just looked like a few sheds sticking out under the water.
Devastating. Loss of homes, loss of personal property, the history that was lost. Goodness gracious, journals, diaries, newspapers, photographs, you name it. So much has been lost.
People basically were scrambling to survive.
There are three things about the 1937 flood that just astound me. We are in the middle of a depression. These people had no money in the first place. So many homeless, so many poor. And to think that there was the loss of 1 million homes along the Ohio River, 385 people killed, $500 million in losses, money-wise. Even by today's standards, that's incredible. But you talk about 1937, then on top of that, they're in a depression.
River stage at 10 o'clock tonight, 76.8 feet. That is approximately 25 feet above flood stage. Fires which threatened the entire western section of Cincinnati this morning are reported under control at this hour. Flood boats, great yawls which have been rushed from the Atlantic seaboard and the Great Lakes, are now resting in the floodwaters, moored to the tops of lampposts and telegraph poles.
New Richmond was among the communities in the pathway of the floodwaters that raged along an almost 1,000-mile path from Pittsburgh to Cairo, Illinois.
It basically devastated New Richmond. It could have wiped New Richmond off the map.
Margaret Fulton was a 24-year-old newlywed living with her husband Frank on Sophia Street, not far from the river's edge in New Richmond. She remembers the heavy rains that wouldn't stop and how the river started coming up into businesses and homes.
We just knew we was going to have to move out, and it started coming up pretty fast. And my husband said, well, we got to get the furniture out. We had a little Model T pickup truck, and he moved all our furniture up on the second floor across the highway.
The young couple headed to the nearby home of her mother and father-in-law. It was on higher ground.
And the water kept coming up, and my father-in-law, we called him Pop, he sat by the end window of the house watching that water, and it was coming up through his garden, backing up in the creek, and he kept watching that all day long. He'd just sit there and watch it, and he could see it coming up.
As the water neared the house, the entire Fulton family and all their neighbors were again forced to find shelter on higher ground.
The river reached its peak at 79.9 feet in Cincinnati on January the 26th. And then it began to start coming back down a little bit.
A lot of people, they lost everything because the homes that were 2 stories, and back then a lot of homes were 2 stories, everything was moved up to the second floor. People had to actually be rescued from boats out their windows on the second floor.
Mom had one of my older brothers, of course. She was on the front page of the Cincinnati Times-Star. They were pulling her out of a window in an apartment building down in the west end of town with the baby, getting into a canoe.
The swirling dark floodwater didn't give people long to prepare to evacuate.
You were just thinking of saving lives. You wasn't thinking of saving records. So a lot of the village records were lost in the flood.
Throughout New Richmond, there is evidence of the 1937 flood and others that have spilled into the village. At the historic Ross Gowdy House on George Street, Edna Burns, president of the Historic New Richmond organization, points to the side of the house and a small plaque from the 1884 flood to help us visualize the depth of the water.
The water got up to 71.7 feet, and that marks where it got on this building. And in 1937, I believe the official reading was 79.9 feet when the river crested. It would be probably to the top of the second floor windows.
The water swallowed much of what was once a hotel, now known as the Springer House.
The New Richmond Hotel, back in 1937, the water was up above the second story windows.
Up the street, the woolen mill was also underwater.
The people in New Richmond, when they fled their homes, many of them camped along Long Hill and Short Hill, the two streets there. People described it, a lot of the towns, you could see campfires way up on the hillsides.
And you could see the river from the hills, and I said, well, yeah, look at that. I said, I know it's already got our furniture.
Looking up and down the Ohio River banks, it is hard to imagine the bustling riverfront that was. In Clermont County, entire towns were silenced by the waters.
You had Palestine. Who hears about Palestine anymore? It was a beautiful community. You can still drive along the main street there, parallel to the river, but so much is gone. And then you've got New Richmond, and goodness gracious, just devastating. But that town survived better than the rest, simply because it was larger. But and then you've got Claremontville. Who hears of Claremontville anymore? And then you continue up the river, and then you go to Shiloh, and rural. You can't. The only thing that points out rural primarily is Bullskin Creek, and then you have Smith's Landing. There is absolutely nothing of Smith's Landing. There's an old dirt road goes down to where Smith's Landing was, and then there's Utopia, and so much is gone,
including over 80 homes in Moscow. For those who were able to stay or who camped nearby, water problems were only the beginning.
Water had to be brought in. There was no drinking water. The sewage system was not as it was now. I mean, it was a health hazard down here. There was frequent fires where the gas lines and gas tanks exploded. So you not only had your loss by water, if your house did remain, sometimes it had caught on fire and burned down and lost it that way.
Historian Crawford said you would need scuba gear to see some of the remnants of county river communities that once welcomed people and now welcome only aquatic life.
This county at one time was 3 plateaus along the Ohio River. You can't see the first plateau. It's under 20 feet of water. And when they've dredged the river in the past and lowered the water way down, you can see all sorts of what used to be parts of communities, homes. Utopia is the best known example. The spiritualist home, their entire gathering was devastated in a flash flood in December of 1847. Everybody but 6 people were killed, and that swamped the first plateau. That village of spiritualists was built on the first plateau. Many people built on the first plateau. And even today, like in Moscow and some of the other towns, when they lower the river, you can see where the steamboat landing went way below what the water level is today.
There were plenty of valiant efforts to save homes and businesses. Many failed.
At that time, the store in Point Pleasant was completely wiped off of its foundation. Those people, I mean, the 37th flood for them, basically the only store in the town is gone.
But there were some successes.
There were 2 areas in this county through different floods that people fought hard to preserve things. U.S. Grant's birthplace is right down there on Big Indian Creek, where it flows into the Ohio. The people of Point Pleasant and the surrounding area practically built a fortress around Grant's birthplace so it wouldn't be touched. They were scared to death that would be taken off its foundation and floated down the river, and there, the birthplace of a president of the United States would be lost. There was an incredible human versus river battle there. And we had another example of that in the little town of Allisonia, which was later on called Stone Lick, where State Route 222 dead ends at on US 50. They built a fortress of sorts around the two-story building, but of General Richard Allison, the first Surgeon General of the United States.
During the flood, homeowners were glued to their radios, listening to the latest predictions on when the rain would finally stop.
And my father-in-law was always listening to the radio and always sitting by his window watching the water come up in his garden.
The major radio station had their weatherman was named Devereaux. And Devereaux was always reporting, oh, the rain's slowing down, it's going to stop, the floodwaters are going to be coming down. And nothing stopped. 13 days in a row. Every day, here the waters were falling and the river was rising. And they started calling him Never Know instead of Devereaux because he kept reporting this and nothing was happening.
Margaret Fulton said she actually viewed some of the flood damage in a boat.
My brother-in-law, he had a John boat and he rode around, and we also took a ride in the John boat too. We went down Clermontville Laurel Road in a boat instead of a car. Boy, that river was so wide. It was wider than the Mississippi, I think.
After the waters began to climb back into their banks, you could see the true nature of the disaster. Homes and businesses destroyed or horribly damaged by mud and other debris.
The mud was about 12 to 18 inches deep. We had to walk in the tire tracks of the cars.
A January 27, 1937 edition of the Claremont Courier praised the community for pulling together to help their neighbors survive the flood. The paper reported the Red Cross set up food and housing stations in several communities, including Bethel and Felicity, to help those displaced. The Grant Memorial Building became an emergency hospital. After fleeing from the waters twice, Margaret said she didn't think twice about moving back home to New Richmond.
We didn't know where else to move. Everything, we'd have to move out away from everybody we knew.
It's your home. No matter where you've chose to live in your life, that is your home. And just because of a natural disaster doesn't mean you don't still have those financial responsibilities of that home. Just because a flood comes to your home doesn't get rid of your mortgage. So you go back to your home, you rebuild. It's emotional and it's also financial. It is what has made people who live along any river strong. It is your roots.
The immediate reaction to the flood was to try to ensure it would never happen again. Now, most people back then, and even today, a lot of people think the dams on the river are used to control the floods. They're not. They were to ensure year-round travel by boats on the river. Because the Ohio River, in the days of the pioneers, the early settlers, the Indians and all that, was no more than 3 or 4 feet deep normally, and maybe 10 feet wide at the widest point. And even steamboats back then needed only 3 or 4 feet of water to successfully go down the river. This was to ensure year-round travel because the steamboats were getting outdated. There's these enormous boats, very heavy, needed more water. So all these dams were built to ensure that the river was raised, and the original raise was up to 12 feet, and then today it's 26 feet. So we have the dam at Shiloh, and of course then the Meldal Dam was built later to raise the water even higher. But what happened is the federal government had passed enough money to construct reservoirs all along the Ohio River. And Claremont County has 2 of those reservoirs. East Fork State Park, which was completed in the 1970s, and Stone Lick Lake State Park, which was completed in the 1940s, were constructed to hold river waters back.
Well, in 1937, this area was a river, and now it is a lake. So that was a dramatic change in the 1970s when the Corps of Engineers came in and began building the dam that created this beautiful lake. What happens when the lake gets really high is it'll cover up recreation facilities such as the boat ramp and the beach, but if we were to keep holding back water, it would eventually flow into what's called an emergency spillway. The emergency spillway is at a lower elevation than the top of the dam, which means that the dam could never ever be overtopped, even if we were holding back as much water as the lake could possibly hold. I believe that this past spring kind of gave us an indication that we can certainly handle more rain than maybe we could have back in 1937. This spring we had our wettest year on record, and also we reduced the amount of flooding. We certainly didn't see the type of flooding that we saw back in 1937.
While the 1937 flood was devastating locally, Crawford said there is evidence that floodwaters were possibly higher during an earlier part of our history.
The Indians, when the first American settlers came into the area, the early pioneers, told stories of the early 1700s in one particular year, and nobody seems to know what year that was. Of course, the Indians didn't, know or care what year it was. But they reported that there was one year there was a flood that covered from the tops of the hills in Ohio all the way over to the tops of the hills in Kentucky. Now, can you imagine how deep that must have been?
With all the flood control efforts that have been undertaken in the area, can we ever say a flood like the one in 1937 will never happen again?
I never say never. Never know would know that pretty well after all his predictions.